The whisper of death had followed Penelope Vickers all the way from Boston to Hawthorne, Nebraska territory. 1867, but it wasn't her own demise she feared as she stood trembling before the general store's counter. A loaf of bread concealed beneath her shawl, and the unmistakable swell of her 5-month pregnancy visible despite her efforts to hide it. Thief! The shopkeeper's accusation cut through the quiet store like a gunshot, his gnarled finger pointing directly at her. "Empty your shawl, woman." Penelope's green eyes widened with fear, her chestnut hair falling across her pale face as she took a step backward. The journey west had taken everything from her husband to cholera, her savings to thieves, and now it seemed her dignity would be the next casualty. "Please," she whispered, one protective hand moving to her rounded belly. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." The shopkeeper, Mr. Horace Tanner, was unmoved by her plea. His face, weathered by years of frontier life, hardened as he came around the counter. "The law's the law, pregnant or not. Sheriff will sort you out." The store had fallen silent, the few other patrons staring at the spectacle before them. Penelope felt her knees weaken, thinking of the small room she'd rented with her last coins and how she'd soon be trading it for a jail cell. Her baby kicked as if sensing her distress. The creaking of the door announced another customer, and all eyes shifted to the tall figure who entered, bringing with him the scent of horses, leather, and the wide open prairie. Preston Galloway removed his hat as he entered, revealing sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. The cowboy's reputation preceded him foreman of the Lazy S Ranch, fair but formidable, and not a man to be crossed. "Afternoon, folks," he said, his deep voice casual despite the tension he'd walked into. "Something amiss, Tanner?" "Caught this one stealing," Tanner responded, still gripping Penelope's arm. "Bread, likely more, calling for the sheriff." Preston's gaze fell on Penelope, taking in her obvious condition, the worn but once fine dress and the desperate fear in her eyes. Something in his chest tightened. He'd seen that look before on the faces of those with nothing left to lose. "How much for the bread?" Preston asked, reaching for his money pouch. Tanner looked confused. "2 bits, but that's hardly the and how much for a month of groceries for the lady?" Preston continued, his voice steady but commanding. A murmur ran through the store. Penelope's lips parted in surprise, her eyes welling with tears she refused to shed. I couldn't possibly tell without knowing what she'd need," Tanner stammered, his grip on Penelope's arm loosening. Preston nodded, placing his hat on the counter before pulling out a considerable sum. $20 should cover it, I expect, plus whatever damages you feel her attempted theft might have caused." Tanner's eyes widened at the money. "No damages. She hadn't made it out the door." "Good," Preston said, his eyes meeting Penelope's for the first time. "Then we'll be needing flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt pork, and whatever else a lady in her condition might require." He turned back to Tanner. "And we'll start with that bread she's holding." Penelope's hand trembled as she revealed the loaf. "Sir, I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Preston interrupted gently. "Consider it a welcome to Hawthorne. Times are hard enough without folks going hungry when they don't have to." Tanner, now eager to please the man whose ranch brought considerable business to his store, began gathering supplies. "Where should I have these delivered, Mr. Galloway?" Preston turned to Penelope expectantly. "Widow Bradley's boarding house," she said, her voice barely audible. "Room 3. Preston nodded. "Have your boy take them over within the hour." He turned back to Penelope, who stood frozen, clutching the bread as if it might vanish. "May I escort you home, madam? These streets can be treacherous for a lady alone." Penelope hesitated. Her husband Thomas had warned her about the dangers a woman might face out west, especially one on her own. Yet there was something about Preston Galloway's steady gaze that didn't set off the alarms her instincts had developed since becoming a widow. Why? She finally asked, ignoring propriety in favor of understanding. Why would you help me? The question seemed to take Preston by surprise. He considered it for a moment before answering honestly. Because I've been hungry before, madam. And because no child should enter this world with their mother in a jail cell for trying to feed them. The simplicity and truth of his answer moved her. Penelope nodded, accepting his escort. As they left the store, whispers followed them, speculation about the mysterious pregnant woman and why Preston Galloway, a man known for keeping to himself, would intervene on her behalf. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked down Hawthorne's Main Street. The town was small but growing, situated along the newly completed Union Pacific Railroad line. Wooden buildings lined the dusty road, some still bearing the raw look of recent construction. "You're new to town," Preston observed, slowing his long stride to match hers. "Yes," Penelope confirmed. "I arrived on Tuesday's train. Heading somewhere in particular, or is Hawthorne your destination?" Penelope swallowed hard. "Hawthorne is as good a place as any to start anew. My husband and I were bound for California, but he didn't survive the journey." Preston's face softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Vickers." "Penelope Vickers," she supplied, shifting the bread to her other arm. "And thank you, Mr. Galloway, though words feel inadequate." "Preston," he corrected, "and there's no need for thanks. Nebraska's hard country, but its people needn't be." They reached the boarding house, a two-story structure that had once been one of the finest homes in Hawthorne before the widow Bradley had converted it to accommodate the town's growing population. Preston paused at the steps, not presuming to enter the women's boarding section without invitation. "The supplies should arrive shortly," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "If you need anything else, why are you really helping me?" Penelope interrupted, her voice stronger now that they were away from prying ears. $20 is no small sum." Preston studied her for a moment, noting the intelligence in her eyes that matched her beauty. This was no helpless damsel, despite her current circumstances. "My mother found herself alone and with child in a strange town once," he finally said. "Someone showed her kindness. I'm just paying it forward." Penelope nodded, accepting his explanation. "Then I thank you not just for myself but for your mother as well." A small smile touched Preston's lips. "Get some rest, Mrs. Vickers. Hawthorne may not look like much, but it's a town with potential. So are you." With that, he tipped his hat and turned to leave. Penelope watched him go, the enigmatic cowboy who had saved her from jail and hunger with equal ease. She didn't know then how their lives would intertwine in the months to come, or how the bread in her arms represented not just sustenance, but the first ingredient in a recipe for a second chance at life and love. She entered the boarding house, the bell above the door announcing her return. Widow Bradley, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, looked up from her ledger. "There you are, Mrs. Vickers. I was beginning to worry." "I'm sorry for the concern," Penelope replied, still clutching the bread. "I had an encounter at the general store." Mrs. Bradley's eyebrows rose. "Oh. Nothing troublesome, I hope?" Before Penelope could respond, a knock came at the door. It was Tanner's delivery boy, arms laden with packages and a wooden crate. "Delivery for Mrs. Vickers," the boy announced, struggling under the weight. Mrs. Bradley's eyebrows climbed even higher. "Well, well," she murmured, helping the boy place the supplies on a nearby table. "It seems you've made an impression on someone." Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's not what you think. Mr. Galloway was simply being kind." "Preston Galloway," Mrs. Bradley whistled low. Now that's interesting. That man hasn't shown particular interest in anyone or anything except his ranch since returning from the war. As the widow helped unpack the supplies far more than Penelope had expected, she peppered her with questions about the encounter. Penelope recounted the events truthfully, including her attempted theft, to which Mrs. Bradley merely nodded without judgment. "Pride's a fine thing until it kills you," the older woman said pragmatically. "You've got more than yourself to think about now." "I know," Penelope sighed, one hand on her belly. "I thought I could make it until I found work, but—" "Work?" Mrs. Bradley looked thoughtful. "Can you read and write well?" "Yes, quite well," Penelope answered, surprised by the question. "I was a teacher in Boston before my marriage." A smile spread across the widow's face. "Well now, that's Providence. Our school teacher, Miss Abernathy, just announced she's leaving to marry her sweetheart in St. Louis. The town council meets tomorrow evening to discuss a replacement." Hope flickered in Penelope's chest for the first time in months. "Do you think they would consider me in my condition?" Mrs. Bradley considered this. Ordinarily, a school teacher with a child and no husband might raise eyebrows, but teachers are scarce out here and you're a widow, not unwed. "Besides," she added with a wink, "having Preston Galloway's apparent approval won't hurt your chances. His ranch employs half the men in town, and the lazy pays taxes that built that schoolhouse." The next day dawned clear and bright, a perfect Nebraska spring morning. Penelope awoke feeling refreshed after her first full meal in days and a night in a real bed. She dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a navy blue cotton with only minor travel wear, and arranged her hair in a modest but flattering style. After a breakfast of the bread Preston had paid for, still miraculous in her mind, she set out to explore Hawthorne properly. The town was bustling despite its small size. The railroad had brought prosperity and growth, and new buildings were going up alongside the original structures. She noted the schoolhouse at the edge of town, a simple but solid building with a small bell tower. As she stood contemplating it, a woman's voice called out to her. "You must be Mrs. Vickers." Penelope turned to see a plump, pleasant-faced woman approaching, a basket of eggs on her arm. "I am," she confirmed cautiously. "Martha Simmons," the woman introduced herself. "My husband owns the livery. Word travels fast in Hawthorne, especially when Preston Galloway breaks his usual reserve to help a lady in distress." Penelope suppressed a sigh. It seemed her introduction to the town would forever be linked to both her shame and her rescue. "I hear you were a teacher back east," Martha continued. "We're in desperate need. My two girls adore Miss Abernathy, but she's lovesick and leaving us high and dry." "I would very much like to apply for the position," Penelope admitted, "though I'm not sure how the council will feel about." She gestured to her pregnancy, and Martha waved a dismissive hand. "Beggars can't be choosers, Mrs. Vickers, and we're begging for someone with proper learning. Besides, most of the council are parents themselves." Her eyes twinkled. "Including Dr. Bennett, who'll just be relieved to have someone teach those children their letters so they stop bringing him incomprehensible notes about their ailments." Martha's friendly chatter continued as she walked with Penelope, pointing out town landmarks and introducing her to passers-by. By the time they reached the doctor's office, where Martha was delivering eggs, Penelope had met what felt like half the town. Dr. Bennett proved to be a serious man in his 40s with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. He examined Penelope briefly at Martha's insistence. "The baby seems healthy," he pronounced. "But you're underweight, Mrs. Vickers. Regular meals and rest are essential." "I'll do my best," Penelope promised, thinking of the groceries waiting in her room. "See that you do," he replied sternly before adding, "I understand you're considering the teaching position." Yes, if the council will have me. Dr. Bennett nodded approvingly. I'll be at the meeting tonight. A proper education is the best medicine for many of society's ills. By evening, Penelope had prepared a brief statement about her qualifications and experience. Mrs. Bradley helped her adjust her dress to minimize her condition without hiding it entirely. No sense pretending it isn't there, but no need to make it the first thing they notice either. The town hall was a rectangular building next to the sheriff's office. When Penelope entered, escorted by Mrs. Bradley, she was surprised to find the room already half full. Prospective teachers were apparently big news in Hawthorne. Mayor Edgerton, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, called the meeting to order. Penelope sat quietly as town business was discussed: road repairs, a dispute over water rights, complaints about rowdy cowboys on Saturday nights. Finally, the mayor addressed the teaching vacancy. Miss Abernathy leaves us at month's end. We need a replacement before the children forget all their learning. I might have a solution, Dr. Bennett spoke up. Mrs. Vickers here was a teacher in Boston. She's new to town but comes with experience. All eyes turned to Penelope, who rose with as much dignity as she could muster. Good evening, she began, her teacher's voice steady despite her nerves. I taught for 3 years at the Hancock School for Girls in Boston. I'm proficient in all common subjects as well as literature, basic Latin, and music. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Latin was an impressive credential in frontier Nebraska. And what brings you to Hawthorne, Mrs. Vickers? Asked a stern-faced woman near the front. Penelope took a deep breath. My husband and I were traveling to California when he succumbed to cholera. I continued west but found my circumstances reduced. I believe God led me to Hawthorne for a purpose, and perhaps that purpose is to teach your children. She purposely didn't mention her attempted theft, though she suspected most knew of it already. And your condition, the woman pressed. Children are impressionable. Before Penelope could respond, a deep voice came from the back of the room. Mrs. Vickers is a widow expecting her late husband's child, Mrs. Cranston. If that's improper, then we'd better close half the businesses in town run by widows and widowers. All heads turned to see Preston Galloway leaning against the back wall, arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't changed from his work clothes, suggesting he'd come straight from the ranch. Mayor Edgerton cleared his throat. Mr. Galloway makes a fair point. The question before us isn't Mrs. Vickers' personal tragedy but her qualifications to teach. The discussion continued, with various council members asking Penelope questions about her teaching philosophy and experience. Throughout, she felt Preston's steady gaze on her, though he offered no further comments. Finally, after a brief private consultation, Mayor Edgerton announced, "The council offers the position to Mrs. Penelope Vickers, effective immediately, with the standard salary of $30 per month plus lodging in the teachers' quarters behind the schoolhouse." Relief washed over Penelope so intensely she nearly swayed. A real job, a proper home for her baby, and a place in the community all in one day. As the meeting disbanded, she made her way to Preston, who was speaking with Dr. Bennett. The men paused their conversation as she approached. "Mr. Galloway," she said, extending her hand, "I wanted to thank you again. It seems I'm repeatedly in your debt." Preston took her hand briefly. "Not at all, Mrs. Vickers. Hawthorne needs a good teacher and you need a fresh start. Seems like a fair arrangement to me, Doctor." Bennett excused himself with a knowing smile, leaving them alone in the corner of the rapidly emptying hall. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," Penelope admitted. "I make it a point to attend when I'm in town," Preston replied. "It's good business to know what's happening in the community where my men spend their wages." "Of course," Penelope nodded, feeling oddly disappointed by his practical explanation. "Well, I won't keep you. I'm sure you're busy." Preston studied her face for a moment before saying, "I'll have one of my men bring a load of firewood to the teachers' quarters tomorrow. Nights can still get cold this time of year." "That's very kind, but it's no trouble," he interrupted. "Consider it a welcome gift from the Lazy S." With that, he tipped his hat and departed, leaving Penelope to wonder about the enigmatic cowboy who seemed determined to ease her path in Hawthorne. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Penelope settled into her new role. The teacher's quarters proved to be a small but comfortable two-room cabin attached to the back of the schoolhouse. It had been freshly whitewashed before her arrival and stocked with basic necessities by the town's families. The promised firewood arrived, delivered by a shy young ranch hand who tipped his hat and mumbled that boss said to make sure you had enough to last the month. Miss Abernathy stayed for a week to introduce Penelope to the students and their parents before departing for her new life in St. Louis. The children, 27 in all ranging from 6 to 16, quickly warmed to their new teacher's kind but firm approach. True to form, Hawthorne's gossips had plenty to say about Preston Galloway's interest in the new teacher. But as the days passed with no further interaction between them, the talk gradually subsided. Penelope found herself oddly disappointed by his absence, though she chided herself for the feeling. The man had shown her Christian charity, nothing more. One Friday afternoon in late April, as Penelope was dismissing her students for the weekend, she noticed a familiar figure on horseback waiting at the edge of the schoolyard. Preston sat atop a magnificent chestnut gelding, watching as the children scattered to their homes. "Mr. Galloway," she greeted him, approaching the fence. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Preston dismounted, leading his horse closer. "Mrs. Vickers, I hope I'm not disturbing your day." "Not at all. School's finished until Monday." She smiled, noting that he'd dressed with more care than usual, a clean shirt and his best vest beneath his riding coat. "I wondered if you might permit me to call on you tomorrow," he said, his usual confidence giving way to a hint of uncertainty. "There's a church social in the afternoon. The ranch keeps me too busy for regular attendance, but I try to make these gatherings when I can." Penelope felt her heart flutter traitorously. "That would be lovely, Mr. Galloway." "Preston," he reminded her with a small smile. "If we're to attend together, we should use our Christian names, don't you think, Preston?" she agreed, savoring the feel of his name on her lips. "And you must call me Penelope." "Penelope," he repeated as if testing it. "I'll come by around 1 if that suits you." "It suits me very well." As she watched him ride away, Penelope felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. It had been only 3 months since Thomas's death. Was it disrespectful to feel this quickening in her heart for another man? Yet Thomas himself had urged her to find happiness again if anything happened to him. "Life's too precious and too short to waste in mourning, Penny," he'd said during those terrible days when they'd both known he was dying. The next day, Penelope dressed with particular care in her one good dress, a spring green that brought out her eyes. Her pregnancy was more pronounced now at nearly 6 months, but she no longer felt the need to hide it. Hawthorne had accepted her as she was, baby and all. Preston arrived precisely at 1, driving a smart buggy rather than riding. He had shaved closely and wore a suit that showed off his broad shoulders to advantage. His eyes warmed appreciatively as they took her in. "You look lovely, Penelope," he said simply, helping her into the buggy. "Thank you." "You're quite handsome yourself," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. The church social was held on the grounds of the white clapboard building that served as Hawthorne's only house of worship. Tables laden with food formed a perimeter around an open area where children played and adults mingled. As Preston helped Penelope down from the buggy, she noticed the curious glances directed their way. "People are staring," she murmured. Preston's mouth quirked. "Let them. I've given them precious little to gossip about over the years. They're due some entertainment." His easy dismissal of the town's interest relaxed her, and she took his offered arm as they joined the gathering. Preston introduced her to those she hadn't yet met through school, including several of his ranch hands and their families. The afternoon passed pleasantly with food, conversation, and even some singing when someone produced a fiddle. Preston stayed close to Penelope's side, attentive but never possessive, making sure she had a comfortable seat and bringing her lemonade when she looked warm. As the gathering began to disperse in the early evening, Reverend Mills approached them. The young minister had been one of Penelope's strongest supporters for the teaching position. "Mrs. Vickers, Mr. Galloway," he greeted them warmly. "It's good to see you both here today. Preston, we've missed you at Sunday services." "Spring's a busy time at the ranch, Reverend," Preston replied, though his tone held no defensiveness. "But I'll make more of an effort now that the weather's improved." "See that you do," the minister said with a smile that took any sting from his words. "Mrs. Vickers has been a faithful attendee since her arrival." "Has she now?" Preston glanced at Penelope with new interest. "I'll have to follow her good example." As they drove back toward town in the golden light of early evening, Preston took a different route than expected, following a less traveled road that wound along the river. "I hope you don't mind a slight detour," he said in response to Penelope's questioning look. "There's something I'd like to show you." They crested a small rise, and Preston drew the horses to a stop. Below them stretched a view of the valley with Hawthorne nestled within it, and the vast Nebraska prairie extending beyond. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. "It's beautiful," Penelope breathed, taking in the vista. "This is why I stayed," Preston said quietly. "After the war, I meant to just pass through on my way somewhere else, anywhere else, but I saw this view and something in me knew I was home." The personal admission touched Penelope deeply. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Their eyes met, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he reached over and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've been wanting to ask," he began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Would you allow me to court you properly, Penelope Vickers? I know your situation is complicated, and I know your heart may not be ready, but I find myself thinking about you far more than is sensible for a man who's avoided entanglements for years." Penelope's breath caught. Despite the growing attraction she felt, the reality of their situation was indeed complex. "I'm carrying another man's child," she said quietly. "I know. People will talk. People always talk," Preston countered with a small smile. "The question is whether we care more about their opinions than our own happiness." Penelope considered his words, along with the feelings that had been growing inside her since that day in the general store. There was something about Preston Galloway that called to her soul his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, the depth she sensed beneath his reserved exterior. "I would be honored by your courtship," she finally said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "But I think we should proceed slowly, for both our sakes, and for the babies." Relief and joy spread across Preston's face, transforming his usual stoic expression. "Slowly it is," he agreed, taking her hand and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'm a patient man, Penelope. Some things are worth waiting for." As they returned to town in companionable silence, Penelope felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Life had taken an unexpected turn in Hawthorne, Nebraska territory, and for the first time in months, She was looking forward to the future rather than dreading it. The courtship began with small gestures. Preston attended church with Penelope on Sundays, sitting beside her in the pew, despite the raised eyebrows of some parishioners. He brought her books from his own collection when he learned of her love for reading, and sometimes fresh vegetables from the ranch garden. For her part, Penelope invited him to supper at her small home once a week, proving that her domestic skills matched her academic ones. She listened to his stories of ranch life and the war, the few he was willing to share, and gradually shared more of her own past in Boston. As spring deepened into summer, Penelope's condition became more pronounced. Dr. Bennett assured her that despite her earlier hardships, both she and the baby were thriving. The children in her school were fascinated by her expanding middle, and she used it as an opportunity for impromptu biology lessons that had some parents raising eyebrows, but others nodding approvingly at her practical approach. Preston's attentions never wavered as her pregnancy progressed. If anything, he became more protective, checking on her more frequently and enlisting Martha Simmons and other town women to look in on her when ranch business kept him away. One evening in early July, as they sat on the small porch of the teachers' quarters enjoying the cooler air after a scorching day, Preston broached a subject they had danced around for weeks. "Have you thought about what you'll do when the baby comes?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Teaching with an infant will be challenging." Penelope sighed, rubbing her lower back where an ache had settled. "I've been pondering that very question. The school board has agreed to a 2-month leave, but after that..." She shook her head. "I'll need to find someone willing to mind the baby during school hours." Preston was quiet for a long moment before saying, "There's another option you might consider." "Oh," Penelope looked at him curiously. "Marry me." The simple proposal hung in the evening air between them. Penelope's hand stilled on her back as she stared at him. "Preston, hear me out," he continued, leaning forward in his chair. "I know it hasn't been long and I promise to be patient, but your time is growing short and practical matters need addressing." "You're proposing marriage as a practical solution?" Penelope asked, unsure whether to be touched or offended. Preston ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "I'm making a mess of this," he muttered. "The practicality is just part of it, Penelope. The truth is, I've grown to care for you deeply these past months, more than I thought possible after everything I've seen and done." He rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking out of pity or duty. I'm asking because the thought of you and your child is part of my life, my home, my future. It feels right in a way nothing has since before the war." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes at the raw emotion in his voice. "But the baby will be a blessing," Preston finished firmly. "I never expected to have a family, Penelope. It wasn't in my plans. But then you stole that loaf of bread, and suddenly all my plans changed." A laugh escaped her through the tears. "You're saying you want to marry me because I'm a thief?" His expression softened into a smile. "I'm saying I want to marry you because you awakened something in me I thought was dead. The capacity to care, to protect, to love." The word hung between them, neither having used it before. "Love," Penelope whispered. Preston nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Love," he confirmed. "I love you, Penelope Vickers. Your strength, your kindness, your determination. I'll love this child too if you'll give me the chance to be its father in all the ways that matter." Penelope's heart felt too full for her chest. The feelings that had been growing within her alongside her child suddenly had a name. She loved this man, his quiet dignity, his unexpected tenderness, the way he looked at her as though her increasing girth made her more beautiful, not less. "Yes," she said simply, squeezing his hands. "Yes, I'll marry you, Preston Galloway." The relief and joy that transformed his face made him look years younger. He rose slightly from his knees to kiss her, a gentle press of lips that held the promise of passion tempered with respect for her condition. When they parted, he remained close, his forehead resting against hers. "Soon?" he asked. Penelope laughed softly. "Before I grow any larger, preferably. I'd like to fit through the church door." They were married 2 weeks later in Hawthorne's church, with Reverend Mills officiating and nearly the entire town in attendance. The bride wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Bradley and Martha Simmons had helped fashion to accommodate her 8-month belly with surprising elegance. The groom wore a new suit ordered specially from Omaha and arrived with a haircut so fresh his ears were still pink. Penelope had worried that the sudden nature of their engagement might fuel unfavorable gossip, but Hawthorne surprised her. The town seemed genuinely pleased by the match. As Martha explained, "Everyone's been watching this romance unfold since day one. We were starting to get impatient." After a modest reception at the hotel, Preston drove his new bride to the Lazy S Ranch. Penelope had visited only once before, briefly, and had been impressed by the neat main house and well-ordered-out buildings. Now, as Preston carried her over the threshold despite her protests about her weight, she felt a surge of emotion at the thought that this would be her home, their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Galloway," Preston said softly, setting her gently on her feet in the entry hall. "It feels right," she replied, looking around at the comfortable, masculine furnishings that would soon bear her touch as well. "Like I was always meant to be here." Preston showed her through the house, the large kitchen with its cast iron stove, the cozy sitting room with bookshelves he'd built himself, the dining room where he'd entertained business associates but never friends or family before now. Upstairs, he hesitated before opening the door to the master bedroom. "I've had some changes made," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I hope they meet with your approval." The room was large and airy, with windows facing east to catch the morning light. A massive bed dominated one wall, but it was the corner of the room that drew Penelope's attention. There stood a beautifully crafted wooden cradle, and beside it, a rocking chair cushioned with blue gingham. "Oh, Preston," she breathed, moving to touch the smooth wood of the cradle. "Did you make this?" he nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "I wanted you both to feel welcome, to know this is your home now and the babies too." Tears welled in her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning to embrace him as well as her condition allowed. "Everything is perfect." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of domestic adjustments. Preston introduced Penelope to the ranch hands and their families who lived in smaller cabins on the property. She quickly won them over with her genuine interest in their lives and her willingness to learn about ranch operations. Mrs. Wilson, the widow who had been keeping house for Preston since he purchased the ranch 5 years earlier, initially regarded Penelope with suspicion. But when the new mistress of the house showed no inclination to dismiss her, and instead consulted her about household matters, the older woman thawed considerably. "You've brought life back to this place," Mrs. Wilson commented one morning as she helped Penelope inventory the pantry. "The master was a good employer, always fair, but there was a sadness in him. It's gone now." Penelope smiled, touched by the observation. "The war left marks on many men." Mrs. Wilson nodded sagely. "That it did, but love heals what time alone cannot." August arrived with relentless heat that made Penelope's final weeks of pregnancy especially trying. Preston insisted she rest during the hottest part of the day, often bringing her cool drinks and reading to her while she reclined on their bed, her feet propped on pillows to ease the swelling. It was during one such afternoon, as Preston read from Sense and Sensibility, that Penelope felt the first twinge of what she recognized as labor pains. She said nothing immediately, wanting to be sure. But when a stronger contraction followed 20 minutes later, she placed a hand on the book. "I think we should send for Dr. Bennett," she said calmly. Preston's eyes widened. "The baby seems eager to meet you," she confirmed with a smile that turned into a grimace as another contraction gripped her. Preston moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to emergencies. He sent a ranch hand galloping toward town for the doctor, had Mrs. Wilson prepare the bedroom and heat water, and returned to Penelope's side to hold her hand through each wave of pain. Dr. Bennett arrived an hour later, by which time the contractions were coming regularly. He examined Penelope briefly before pronouncing everything progressing normally. "First babies often take their time," he advised. "It could be several more hours." Indeed, the sun set and rose again before Thomas Galloway Preston Vickers entered the world with a lusty cry that his mother swore was more of a declaration of independence than a complaint. "A fine boy, Doctor," Bennett announced, cleaning and swaddling the infant before placing him in Penelope's arms. "Strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for." Penelope gazed down at her son, overwhelmed with love for the tiny person she and Thomas had created. Dark wisps of hair, still damp from birth, curled against his red face. His eyes, when they briefly opened, were the unfocused deep blue of all newborns. "He's perfect," she whispered, then looked up at Preston, who stood beside the bed with an expression of awe. "Would you like to hold your son?" Preston's head jerked up, his eyes meeting hers with surprise at her choice of words. She smiled encouragingly, and he carefully took the bundled infant into his arms. "Hello, young Thomas," he said softly. "Welcome to the world." In that moment, as Preston gazed down at the child with unmistakable love, Penelope knew she had made the right choice in accepting his proposal. This man would love her son as his own, with no reservations or reminders of another man. The next few weeks passed in the happy blur common to all new parents. Thomas proved to be a good baby, nursing well and sleeping for reasonable stretches. Preston took to fatherhood with surprising ease, gladly holding the infant while Penelope rested or helping with diaper changes without complaint. As September arrived with cooler temperatures, Penelope began to think about the school. She had initially planned to return to teaching after her leave, but her feelings had shifted. The ranch felt like home now, and the thought of leaving Thomas, even in capable hands, for long hours each day made her heart ache. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas sleeping in his cradle beside them, she broached the subject. "I've been thinking about the school," she began. "My leave ends in 3 weeks. Preston turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Have you reached a decision?" Penelope sighed, running a finger along the smooth wood of the cradle. "I love teaching, but I love being Thomas's mother more, and your wife," she added with a smile. "I'm thinking of resigning my position." Relief washed over Preston's features. "I'd like that very much," he admitted. "But I didn't want to influence your decision. I know how important your independence is to you." "It is," she agreed, "but family is more important, and perhaps I can still contribute to education in Hawthorne. I've been thinking of starting a lending library, perhaps offering advanced lessons to students who wish to continue their education beyond what the school provides." Preston's face lit up with enthusiasm. "That's a wonderful idea. We could convert the front parlor, we hardly use it anyway. And I could build shelves." He trailed off with a self-conscious laugh. "Listen to me getting carried away." "I love your excitement," Penelope said, reaching for his hand. "It's one of the things I love most about you, your willingness to support my dreams even as they change." He squeezed her hand gently. "Your dreams became mine the moment you agreed to be my wife." The months passed, and Thomas grew from a newborn to an active infant. His first smile, directed at Preston as he sang a silly ranch song while changing a diaper, brought tears to Penelope's eyes. His first laugh came during a game of peekaboo with Mrs. Wilson, who thereafter became his devoted playmate during her work hours. The lending library became a reality, with Preston converting the formal parlor into a warm, inviting space lined with bookshelves. Penelope wrote to her former colleagues in Boston, who responded generously with donations of books. The people of Hawthorne contributed what volumes they could spare, and Preston purchased a significant collection from a bookseller in Omaha. By Thomas's first birthday in August 1868, the Galloway Lending Library was a thriving part of the community. Penelope's advanced classes, offered 3 afternoons a week, had 6 regular students, 4 girls and 2 boys who dreamed of college or professional careers that required more education than Hawthorne's school could provide. Life fell into a pleasant rhythm. Preston ran the ranch with the same steady hand as always, but now he returned each evening to a home filled with warmth and laughter. Penelope balanced motherhood with her educational endeavors, finding fulfillment in both roles. Thomas thrived, growing into a curious, affectionate toddler who followed his pa adoringly whenever Preston was home. In the spring of 1869, as Thomas approached his 2nd birthday, Penelope discovered she was expecting again. When she shared the news with Preston, his reaction was one of pure joy, lifting her off her feet in a gentle spin before setting her down with a kiss that left her breathless. "Another child," he murmured against her hair. "Our child." The significance of his words wasn't lost on her. Though he'd never shown any differential treatment of Thomas, she knew this baby represented something special, physical proof of their love. "Thomas will be excited to be a big brother," she said, leaning into his embrace. "He'll be a good one," Preston agreed. "He has your heart." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with none of the stress and uncertainty that had marked her time carrying Thomas. In November, as the first snows of winter dusted the Nebraska plains, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth Grace Galloway. Elizabeth was the image of her father, with wispy blonde hair and eyes that quickly settled into the same storm cloud gray. Thomas, now old enough to understand, was fascinated by his tiny sister, constantly wanting to touch her and bring her his toys, which were still far too large for the infant. "Gentle son," Preston would remind him, showing by example how to softly touch the baby's hand or smooth her hair. As the children grew, so too did the bond between Penelope and Preston. The passion that had been carefully banked during her first pregnancy and the early months of motherhood blossomed into a deep physical and emotional connection that left them both marveling at their good fortune. "Did you ever imagine this would be your life?" Penelope asked one night as they lay in bed, the house quiet with sleeping children and the distant sounds of the nighttime prairie drifting through the open window. Preston propped himself on one elbow, looking down at her with a tenderness that still made her breath catch. "Never. I came back from the war empty, Penelope, just going through the motions of living. Building the ranch gave me purpose but not joy." He traced her cheek with gentle fingers. "You brought that back, you and Thomas and Elizabeth." "All because I stole a loaf of bread," she mused with a smile. "Best theft in history," Preston chuckled, pulling her closer. "Though I'm glad you retired from your life of crime." I don't know," she teased, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "I did steal your heart after all." "That you did, Mrs. Galloway," he agreed, his voice deepening. "And I have no desire to get it back." 5 years passed, bringing more changes to the Galloway family and to Hawthorne itself. The town grew as the railroad brought more settlers west, and the Lazy S Ranch prospered under Preston's management. They added a second son, James, in 1871, completing their family. Thomas, now 7, was the spitting image of his biological father but had Preston's steady nature and love of the land. Elizabeth, at 5, was a spirited child with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. James, the baby at 3, was a sunny child who charmed everyone he met. The lending library had expanded to include a proper schoolroom where Penelope now taught a dozen advanced students. Several of her first pupils had gone on to universities in the East, writing back with news of their successes and thanking her for believing in their potential. In the summer of 1873, as they celebrated their 6th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Penelope with a trip to San Francisco, a journey they'd make by the Transcontinental Railroad, leaving the children in the capable hands of Mrs. Wilson and Martha Simmons for 2 weeks. "Are you sure?" Penelope asked, both excited and apprehensive about leaving her children for so long. "I'm sure," Preston confirmed. "You've talked about seeing the ocean since we met. It's time we made that happen." The journey west was a revelation. Penelope, who had traveled from Boston to Nebraska in grief and hardship, now experienced the wonder of crossing the continent in relative comfort, with the man she loved beside her. They marveled at the changing landscapes, the vast prairies giving way to mountains, deserts, and finally the lush valleys of California. San Francisco enthralled them both with its hills, its cosmopolitan atmosphere, and most of all, the mighty Pacific Ocean. Penelope stood at the shore, her skirts whipping in the salt breeze, and felt tears of joy stream down her face. "It's everything I imagined," she said as Preston came to stand beside her, his arms slipping around her waist. "Thank you for this gift." "Seeing your happiness is gift enough for me," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. On their last night in the city, as they dined in their hotel overlooking the bay, Preston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "What's this?" Penelope asked, surprised. "You've already given me so much. Open it," he urged with a smile. Inside was a delicate gold locket, oval-shaped and engraved with intricate scrollwork. When she opened it, she found tiny portraits of their 3 children on one side and a lock of her own hair on the other, hair she'd cut just before their wedding and had wondered what had become of. "Preston," she breathed, touched beyond words. "I had the jeweler here make it from a design I chose," he explained. "So you can always keep them close to your heart, even when we're far from home." Penelope fastened the locket around her neck, where it would remain for decades to come. "It's perfect, like everything you've given me." "Everything?" Preston raised an eyebrow with a teasing smile. "Everything that matters," she amended. "A home, a family, a purpose, and most of all, love when I thought I'd never feel it again." Preston took her hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "And you gave me the same gifts, Penelope. When I saw you that day in the general store, something told me my life was about to change. I didn't know then how completely or how wonderfully." They returned to Hawthorne and the Lazy S with renewed appreciation for their life together. The children, thrilled to have their parents home, clamored for stories of the ocean and the big city. Thomas proudly showed them how he'd helped with ranch chores in his father's absence, while Elizabeth presented a stack of drawings, and little James simply refused to leave his mother's lap for the entire evening. As summer faded into autumn, and then into winter, the rhythms of ranch life continued. The lending library celebrated its 5th anniversary with the addition of 100 new volumes, funded by a donation from a former student now practicing law in Chicago. Penelope's advanced classes grew to include students from neighboring towns who traveled weekly for her instruction. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside and a fire crackled in the hearth, the Galloway family gathered in their cozy sitting room. The children, finally asleep after the excitement of hanging their stockings, had left behind the comfortable disarray of a happy home, wooden toys scattered on the rug, a half-finished puzzle on the table, tiny wool stockings draped over chair backs to dry after a snowball fight. Penelope sat beside Preston on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder as they enjoyed the quiet moment together. The locket he'd given her in San Francisco gleamed in the firelight against her dress. "I was thinking about that Christmas 6 years ago," Preston said softly. "Our first as a married couple with Thomas just a few months old. I remember," Penelope smiled at the memory. "You were so nervous about everything, afraid to hold him wrong, afraid the gifts you'd chosen for me were inadequate. I wanted everything to be perfect for you both," he admitted. "I still do." Penelope lifted her head to look at him. "It is perfect, Preston, not because there are no challenges or hard days, but because we face them together." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "When I came to Hawthorne, I was lost and desperate. I never imagined I'd find not just safety, but such happiness. When you were caught stealing that bread," Preston mused, "I acted on instinct. Something about your courage, your dignity, even in that moment of shame, it called to me. And I'm forever grateful you answered that call," she replied, leaning up to kiss him softly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady, much like the love that had begun with a simple act of compassion in a general store and grown into a life neither of them could have imagined on their own. Thomas, Elizabeth, and James would awaken the next morning to stockings filled with treats and presents waiting beneath the tree. But the greatest gift in the Galloway household had already been given years before the gift of second chances, of family forged through choice rather than just blood, and of love that had transformed two broken paths into one beautiful journey. As they sat together in the quiet of Christmas Eve, Penelope Galloway thought back to that desperate woman who had hidden a loaf of bread beneath her shawl, certain her future held nothing but struggle and loneliness. How wrong she had been. Life had brought her not just bread but abundance, not just survival but joy, and not just a provider but a partner who loved her completely. "Merry Christmas, my love," Preston whispered, drawing her closer. "Merry Christmas," she replied, safe in the arms of her cowboy, surrounded by the life they'd built together, a life that had begun with stolen bread and a stranger's kindness, and blossomed into the greatest love story either could have imagined.